The gaze, a meeting point between visual arts and feminist critical theory. The gaze is an act of seeing which creates a division between the bearer of the look and the looked upon, similar to the division between active and passive, and that of subject and object. The importance of the act of seeing in visual arts, and especially in cinema, can be divided into three major subjects. So, at first, there is the intradiegetic gaze. The intradiegetic gaze determines the relations between the characters of the movie. Second, there is the look of the camera that determines the perspective through frame and camera movements. Then, there is the gaze of the spectator himself, who views the film through the perspective of the camera and identifies with the protagonist. So, we may ask, what kind of impact does this kind of medium have on society? Walter Benjamin, in his essay "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction," talked about the loss of the unique individual aura of art. Art was turned into a mass product and determined by mass audience, so the individual was subordinated to it. Film itself was one of the instances in which the mass comes face to face with itself. On this concept and on this kind of Marxist thought, Jean-Luc Comolli and Jean Narbonne wrote in their essay Cinema, Ideology and Criticism in 1968. They saw realism as it was represented in film really as a sort of technique to reproduce dominant ideology and to make it seem the only possible truth. So it was really a way to inflict power upon the masses and really perpetuate the dominant ideology. So when it comes to the concept of the gaze in feminist critical theory, this concept was developed in the 1970s, and it may have started with John Berger, who wrote about a BBC series in his essay Ways of Seeing. Here he talks about the division between men and women and their representation. He says, men act, women appear. Men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor in herself is male, the surveyed female. So what he determines throughout this essay is that since the Renaissance and onwards, women were depicted in European art form as aware of being looked upon. On the other hand, Luce Irigaray, in her essay Another Cause, Castration, from 1974, talked about Freudian psychoanalysis as also determined by sort of a male gaze, which defines woman as lack or absence. In his essays about sexuality, Freud explains the castration complex of women and men. So this theory talks about how the child discovers his own sexuality. And this is through absence or the presence of the fellows. So the thought of the mother from the child, when the child thinks of his mother, is that his mother has been castrated, and this creates a sort of fear or threat for a man and a frustration or penis envy in women. So the psychoanalytical discourse itself is one that is essentially phallocentric and based on the visual evidence, the phallus, of positive sexuality. It is not an accurate account, though, of female psychology or sex, but rather a mirror reflecting what the phallocentric discourse wants to impose on women. Psychoanalytic discourse, then, functions as a discourse of power over women. This sort of thoughts have inspired Laura Mulvey, who 3 years after, in 1975, has written one of the most important essays on the concept of the gaze and related it to visual arts critique, or rather to a critique on mainstream film. She wrote in her essay "Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema" that psychoanalysis and the psychoanalytic discourse really pervades throughout mainstream narrative cinema, and she detects this as being a patriarchal form, of course. So film, the mainstream film plays, reflects and enforces those notions of sexual difference and identity established by Freud. Through the eye of the protagonist and the spectator, woman becomes an object. She says, "Women stand in patriarchal culture as a signifier of the male other, bound by a symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command by imposing them on the silent image of women, still tied to her place of bearer and not maker of meaning." Here then, psychoanalysis is used as a tool to deconstruct the ways in which film attributes and perpetuates the significance of women. So what she wants to do is use this deconstruction as a sort of a weapon against this kind of discourse. If she dismantles the pleasures provoked in film, she can then act against them in her own art. So what she says about the act of seeing and how it creates pleasure in the viewer is through two different concepts. The first one being scopophilia, which creates a sort of voyeuristic pleasure. It is one where the spectator is drawn into the illusion of being watching and looking into a private world, which gives him a sense of power. And the second one drives on the narcissistic nature of the spectator as well. The film itself draws attention to the human form and provides the spectator with a platform of identification with an idealized alter ego. So whereas the voyeuristic pleasure, the first one, is gained from the female, the narcissistic pleasure is gained from the identification with the male protagonist. So women then are images and men are bearer of the looks. She says, in their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for a strong visual and erotic impact, so that they can be said to connote to be looked atness. When she thinks then about mainstream film, she says that normally women appear and stop the narrative. The protagonists and the